welcome to this INGSA Horizon Series interview. This is a series of interviews that aims to bring you provocative and challenging conversations from interesting people across the world working at the science, policy and society interface. Today's interview is with Dr. Claire Craig. Dr. Craig is the Provost of the Queen's College, Oxford in the UK, and has extensive experience in providing scientific evidence to decision makers in government and business. She learned strategy at McKinsey. She spent a long part of her career in the civil service. She established the UK's Foresight Initiative, and she led the UK's Government Office for Science for some time. Claire, welcome to the interview.
Good to be here. Nice to see you again.
Yes, I should introduce myself. I am Sarah Dillon. I'm a reader in literature and the public humanities in the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge, perhaps not a discipline that has featured prominently in INGSA interviews, but we'll get on to that. I also moonlight as a BBC Radio Arts broadcaster, and it will be in that capacity that I will be functioning to some extent today. Although I need to confess, we need to confess, Claire, that I am also Claire's co-author on a new book that's coming out in November called Storylistening, Narrative Evidence and Public Reasoning. Claire and I have been working on it for the past 3 years or so, and much of what Claire will talk about today will be informed by that work, but I am going to have an interviewer hat on, although we may change roles every so often as the questions demand, so we'll just see how it goes. Yeah. Okay, all right then. Well, to kick off, Claire, INGSA, to state the obvious, is the International Network of Government Science Advice. And I wanted to start by asking you if we're missing anything by talking about just about science advice and scientific evidence.
Sure. Naomi Oreskes' Eric Conway's book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, which is a history written from the future, actually it posits that the division between science in the sense of the kind of physical and natural sciences and the humanities is one of the reasons why Western civilization collapses. Now, that's a pretty dramatic way of saying that if you really want to use all of human knowledge to tackle and understand what's going on in the world and to do and to make really good policy choices about it, whether it's climate change or anything else, then you've got to draw on all forms of academic and rigorous insight. And I mean, part of the driver for this book that we've so enjoyed writing in the pandemic era, kind of on all the virtual ways that it's been possible to do that, it has been to make it easier to integrate or to incorporate particular forms of humanities knowledge into the broad umbrella of scientific advice and evidence to enrich all of it.
So if we're talking, I guess, in my language about what we'd call kind of interdisciplinarity and then the necessary of knowledge from different disciplines, but to sort of translate it into INGSA language, and we've been doing a lot of kind of translating backwards and forwards between different languages, I think, over the last few years. If we've got scientific evidence, is there a kind of another kind of evidence that we could have, another adjective we could put with evidence?
Goodness. For the specific types of evidence that we've been looking at in the book, narrative evidence is a term that we can use. I mean, there are other forms of evidence coming from the humanities that are also not incorporated in the kind of narrower definitions of what science is. I should say, by the way, that some people say that science as a term covers all forms of academic knowledge. So yeah. I just want to acknowledge that, and also we shouldn't get too hung up on definitions, but basically clearly there are ways that humans make sense of the world that are rigorous and thoughtful and can be made explicit, that come from humanities, and in particular in what we're going to talk about come from the way that humans think and communicate and understand the world in narrative forms as well as in, say, computational forms.
Yeah, so you said we're not to get caught up on definitions. No, I like my definitions. So when you said narrative evidence, how would you explain that or define that for our listeners?
I mean, one of the kind of slightly amusing things once you start looking at it is how people tend to use the word story when they want to denigrate and narrative when they want to be serious. We deliberately, as you know, we made a slightly risky choice to talk about stories and story listening. Basically, a story is something where there's a causal account. There's some entities with agency, and there are some causal relationships, and something happens. I would say, I mean, you're the literature expert, but that's my layperson
Sounds
summary
good.
of stories.
And then narrative evidence can be derived from, you know, listening to stories, as we would go into.
Yes, and so narrative evidence then in that sense is kind of the critical process, and listening is, listening is more than just kind of hearing or looking at. It's incorporating, it's paying attention to. And so part of what we're going to talk about is what does it mean to critically listen to stories. And again, one of the driving factors for wanting to talk about this now and here in the INGSA world is that critically listening to stories is part of helping all of us to be more confident in navigating the kind of post-truth, anything goes free-for-all, and the kind of worry about or fear about stories as these seductive, charismatic things that if you start paying attention to them will cause you to throw out of the window all forms of kind of rigorous critical thinking. And what I think we're trying to say is, you can be really rigorous and critical in thinking about stories.
Yeah, and you've preempted what I wanted to ask you about, which was to sort of play devil's advocate to some extent, and or address the elephant in the room, which will be that a lot of people will just, don't want to touch stories. They are seen as associated, especially over the past few years in the West, at least, with misinformation, disinformation, a kind of total erosion of faith in evidence and facts. But what you're saying is that actually, we can't ignore them. We have to pay attention to them, and therefore we need frameworks to do so in rigorous and serious ways.
Tools to think with about them, basically. Yeah,
because they're not just going to disappear because we don't want to deal with them. Yeah. Okay. So if people accept that premise, then I guess it begs the question of how, like, what are those tools? What are those frameworks? How can decision makers take stories seriously?
So I guess, there's a kind of process answer, if you like, and then maybe the conceptual framework. But the process answer I would start with is, at least for me, is kind of building off the kinds of ways in which INGSA members would know other forms of evidence can get into policy making and decision making. In other words, that you need to bring in the right kinds of experts into your advisory systems as you have them, and that might be an advisory system that's actually just kind of bringing people together because there's an emergency in the space of hours or days, or it might be something very elaborate and well established like the IPCC, but kind of at every scale of every form of advice for different types of policy decision, there are ways in which you can bring experts in, and part of this argument is to broaden the range of those who would be part of that advice creation and seeking. And it's really important. This is not a kind of Me Tooism. This is actually saying, some of the limits, and we saw it. A very specific example would be some of the advice on Ebola from the UK's perspective about 5 or 6 years ago. There are limits to how humans can make sense of complicated systems of complexity and uncertainty using scientific evidence, and some of the forms of narrative evidence can complement the scientific evidence if they're introduced properly, and it's very much not an either or, but it's bringing them together, and it's through the experts, through the forms of evidence acquisition, evidence synthesis, that kind of thing. But maybe you meant more about how we
no, well, that's really interesting. Just before we move on, so you mentioned Ebola. So how was different kinds of evidence brought in that instance?
So from the UK's perspective, this was a story really where when the outbreaks began in West Africa, the Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies, which is a mechanism that's now much better known in the UK.
Yes, we all know that now, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. At that point, it was very obscure, but it was essentially epidemiologists and a number of other specific experts, and their advice was sound and proper, but basically wasn't having the impact impact on the ground. And it was when they incorporated the knowledge of historians and anthropologists of the relevant areas that they better were able to understand both the kind of epidemiology of the disease and also the practices and so forth that would enable a better ways of tackling it. And this isn't just about communicating, because the other thing that I know, I mean, you probably know better than I, that kind of drives humanities people bonkers is being told, you know, kind of there's some advice which is scientific, and then we'll bring some humanities or creatives people in to tell us how to communicate it. It's absolutely not. I mean, you know, what we're talking about is different ways of thinking about the world, of modelling. We'll come on to this, I'm sure, but you know, of humanities knowledge as part of knowledge about sense making, not about communicating.
Yeah, so different forms of evidence are themselves different forms of knowledge, rather than ways of communicating different types of evidence. Yeah, humanities scholars would be very appreciative of that that often, as you say, reductive, or, you know, in some senses, you know, dismissive way of understanding the kinds of work that we do and the kind of knowledge that we produce. I just to give the specific the example that kind of crystallized why I was really interested in writing this book. When I was at the Royal Society, we did a report on machine learning, kind of the beginning of the current wave of interest in AI. And it was, you know, super report, super experts, lots and lots of detail, took I forget, you know, a year, or, you know, really thorough piece of work. And when it was discussed in policy and in the media, it came out with, always, it was kind of reported with a picture of the Terminator robot. And people would, so the scientists and the policymakers would tend to, they didn't know, they either dismissed that and said, you know, this is ridiculous, it's a piece of fiction, doesn't matter, the story is the story, it's about machine learning. Or they would say, you know, completely, sometimes the same person would give the contradictory view. This is very bad because it shows that people are going to expect that AI is all about killer robots, and it will influence the political and therefore the policy making environment because it will inform what they think about machine learning. Or occasionally people would say, well, it's a metaphor for fears about unstoppable malign forces like big tech or government, depending on what your prejudice is, as it were. But either which way, it was like, it was all this effort into the technology and the science, and yet it was a kind of, you know, amateur moment in terms of interpreting this kind of you know, associated forms of public thinking about what machine learning might mean. And that was why I got interested. Why was there so much effort on the one side, but no thoughtful voices about other forms of representation of machine learning on the other? Yeah, that's fascinating in that sense that you interestingly used the word amateur, you know, that sense that expertise is required in these other areas as well, where it might not be yet, you know, recognized that it's needed. Fascinating. So you answered a little bit by talking about the kind of processes that could happen to incorporate this. You mentioned that there was also kind of possibly a conceptual answer to the question of how, you know, how this could be incorporated. I wonder if you could expand on that bit.
Yes. So basically, one thing to put onto one side is the notion of thinking about stories as being things that are to do with empathy. So they clearly, different types of story do create empathy for different types of situation, but we're not interested in that. And you may want to say more about that. What we're interested in is how stories operate collectively and cognitively. So and in that, in order to try to, because I mean, another thing that's going on here is that because humanities often isn't part of the public reasoning sphere in the same context as scientific evidence, there isn't quite the kind of language and habits that a lot of policy people and scientists have built up to work with each other. So what we're trying to do is kind of create tools that will make it easier for a policymaker, say, to know when and how they might reasonably want to incorporate narrative evidence or call on narrative experts, and also for narrative experts, if they want to get to be working with policymakers to find it easy to do that. So we've suggested a fourfold framework, which is to think of the cognitive and collective functions of stories as one to do with creating new points of view, which is really about framing, which is something that policymakers know an awful lot about. How an issue gets framed is really, you know, determinant of everything else that follows. I will ask you about that in a moment. Sorry to interrupt, but we should come back to that, but keep going. So what I was just going to, so framing, the way in which narrative networks form, and how that might create new ways of thinking about different groups of publics or of agents within a policy system. Modelling, which is something I find utterly fascinating, and the way in which narrative models can complement quantitative ones, and indeed models are part of quantitative models as well. And then anticipation and how stories can enable you to think about different forms of plausible futures and hopefully to create wider ranges of plausible futures that then can be debated and incorporated into policy making. So that kind of fourfold framework then could give a way of beginning to help policymakers to think when I might need to call on narrative advice, but also narrative experts to, I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, one of my kind of bugbears when I was back in government was occasionally you'd have finally got some expert humanities person, some wonderful person into a room with you know, a politician, and they say, well, I'd like to problematize the situation. You go, no, you know, the last thing a minister wants is to be told that the situation needs to be problematized. It wasn't even a word I'd ever heard until, yeah, I mean, they know they've got problems. What they want is solutions to problems. Very rigorous, hopefully, thoughtful, careful. They don't have to be simple, but solutions. So there's a kind of, you know, there's a culture building, language building thing that also needs to happen.
Yeah, and an evolution in the structures of public reasoning of humanities people are going to be included in it, but also a kind of reciprocal evolution in the humanities in terms of maybe both our structures and how we conceive of ourselves. The word problematize has perhaps dropped out a little bit my end, but critique is the word that is now being interrogated. This sense of, you know, the humanities only has value because it critiques, you know, the state or government or big business, and there's starting to be pushback against that, and a sort of sense that there's got to be other ways in which what we do is valuable, and that doesn't mean that critique isn't valuable, but there has to be a both and, like they've got to be other ways as well. And I'm kind of giggling as in my head as we do this, because there's a kind of rhythm coming out in this interview that came out over the past 3 years of me kind of wanting to talk about the really academic bits and you pushing against, but we need to think about the practical bits, we need to think about the out-facing bits, we need to have examples, and it's really nice that that's sort of coming across in the way we move through the conversation. There was another question I wanted to ask before we maybe sort of dive in a little bit to how story listening might be relevant to particular concerns that the INGSA audience might have. And that's, I guess it's a little bit coming back to what we talked about in relation to post-truth and disinformation, which is story listening is probably not a word that people are necessarily very familiar with. It's not quite a neologism. It does exist in the world, but not as we have defined it. How is it different to storytelling? Because there is work in the kind of INGSA world about storytelling, about how to tell, you know, either good stories or proper stories, if that's the, you know, the right word, or evidence-based stories. But why story listening rather than storytelling?
So that's proved to be really important point, because as I think we both found, you're talking about story listening, people hear storytelling. I mean, you know, so I mean, it's wonderful. There's lots of, as you say, lots of learning and understand, or better understanding about storytelling and about, you know, functions about persuasion and about behavioural change, all sorts of things like that. Great, super. I actually think in a way, story listening is almost more like exploring the natural world in the way that many physical and natural scientists do. I mean, my origins are as a geophysicist. You know, this is saying not what do you want to happen, not how can you persuade people of something, not, it's saying what is there. Listen to what is being said, not what you want to be said or what you want to hear, but what is being told in this story, and what might it mean, not what do you want it to mean, or not how can you use it necessarily, but just actually it's, you know, and it's a kind of, it's a humility thing almost, of saying this story or this narrative network exists, thinking about it critically, what can I understand about it, and how can it help me to understand the world better? Does that answer the
Yeah, I
question?
think that's a really helpful analogy, and I guess thinking about stories as objects of study rather than as
Yeah.
tools that you can use. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
no, that's really helpful. I want to pick you up on framing, which you mentioned earlier. I listened in preparation for our conversation to the interview with Professor Roger Pilkey, and he was talking about framing very interestingly, and particularly linking it to obviously the current primary context that we're all thinking about, which is the pandemic, and said that in the UK policy might have led a kind of different framing of the pandemic early on in UK policy, which wasn't you've either got public health or you've got economic, viability or success or prosperity, and it's a zero-sum game between them. If that hadn't been the framing, then a different framing might have led to very different decisions and outcomes. And there's also the European Commission's report from a couple of years ago on understanding our political nature, where they talk about framing. They don't talk about stories, but they do talk about narratives, and they talk about metaphor. So that was something that I was just really interested to hear you say more about, is how would the kinds of arguments that you're making, that we're making about story listening, really help move forwards, I guess, these concerns about framing, which are clearly there in the milieu, but perhaps there's more questions about it at the moment than answers.
So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is, having kind of been on the other side, as it were, I think I don't want to be critical of what has gone on in the UK government when all I know about it is what I read in the media. Yeah, that's fine, and others may well know much more. But I cannot imagine what it has been like being, at the forefront of science advice or indeed of political decision making over the last couple of years, and so put that to one side. But he's absolutely right about framing generally, and I mean, this is kind of really well established in policy studies. Paul Kearney's got some really interesting work on it as well. I mean, the sort of slightly less global example for me would be how in the UK the challenge of bovine TB and kind of health in farm animals became framed about badgers and about whether badgers transmitted bovine TB and whether you should cull them and how and so forth. And as it were, that locked in a set of debates that really was not capable of resolution policy-wise or by evidence until it got broadened to be about management of domestic and wild animal populations, about risk management, which is much more boring than thinking about whether you have a badger and but in other words, the wrong framing clearly it matters, or sorry, the choice of framing makes a big difference to what evidence gets incorporated, to whose voices are considered to be important. With story listening and this idea of points of view, the point is that if you listen critically to stories that are in circulation, they might be popular ones in wide circulation. They might be. Oh, by the way, we haven't said, but we don't talk about narrative and fiction and non-fiction, because maybe we should come back to that. But yeah,
yeah,
so
all right, yeah.
Yeah, stories convey different points of view, and the same story can have in fact multiple points of view. That's a version of framing. So if you think about framing as being saying, what is it in this whole big, complicated, amazing world that matters for the policy question that we think we've got, then the different points of view can cause you to say, well, actually, maybe this framing should include something that wasn't already in it, or maybe something that's in my picture of what matters in my framing, there's something that matters more than I thought it did, or less than I thought it did. That's all getting rather abstract. The example, again, going back to AI, would be one framing is around, say, the potential significance of humanoid intelligence or types of intelligence. Some stories convey points of view of distributed intelligence, and they're not the popular ones so often, or they're not apparently the popular ones, but they have very interesting. Heinein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, or a real reading, as you did, or a sort of deeper reading of Terminator about Skynet rather than about the humanoid robot with the red eyes. You're actually looking at distributed. Now, really reframing some of the discussions about what matters in terms of policy to be about distributed intelligences, as opposed to be about whether robots should have personhood, which probably won't be an issue that we really need to think about for a long time, probably. That would help redirect some of the energy and the evidence gathering and the political energy towards the issues that really matter, which are the distributed ones. So that's an example potentially of stories giving insights into different points of view that then reframe an issue, which is what matters about this technology and what should we be considering.
Yeah, yes, while also recognizing that that some stories that you might wish to recognize are misleading or misframing. It's interesting that you bring up the bovine TV article, because people who've been following UK news will know there's a big debate going on at the moment about Geronimo, the alpaca, who has tested positive twice, and the kind of charismatic story about his right to life is framing that debate. And we've moved on from badgers to a different species with that. I want to move on to modelling, because it's also something that I'm really interested in, and I know that it's something that you've been interested in. It's also of course, again, come to light over the pandemic. The pandemic's kind of brought all these kind of quite niche, what would be considered like niche sort of wonky questions into the public realm. But, the heavy use, and again, apologies for the UK context, but it's my knowledge, of epidemiological modelling over the last few years. I'm presuming you're not saying we don't need things like computational modelling, but are there other kinds of models that we can use as well?
Yeah, and I mean, of course not. I mean, this is it's so interesting when you start trying to introduce new ideas, isn't it? It becomes confrontational. It's like, this is we're not. I mean, it's scientific. I was a scientist. Scientific evidence is beautiful, gorgeous. I just want it to be even better. I want it to be able to have more impact in the world, right? And one of the ways that it could do that is by being part of, an ecosystem, if you like, in which some of these other forms of evidence further enrich or inform how problems are thought about and how they're defined. So, I mean, first of all, kind of the work of Mary Morgan, or actually in a very different way, Ted Shepherd on storyline thinking in climate analysis. They incorporate, they talk about how narratives or stories prompt models and inform the construction of models, as well as the communication of the outcomes of models. So there's an alignment between models and quantitative models and philosophical models in that sense. We're talking about narrative models. So the sort of potentially, well, an example would be not a scientific one, is if you take the novels of Jane Austen, then in part they are modelling part of a real world. And they're modelling aspects of the kind of social economic arrangements of a particular segment of the upper class of the UK of the whenever it was early 19th century sort of thing. So they're providing a model of social arrangements. Yeah, they're not discussing or modelling colonialism, which was going on at the same time, or a whole range of things. And that's classic. Models are not meant to model reality. They abstract from reality certain things that then enable you to think about reality, or the bits of reality that you're really interested in. And stories do that, just as in fact computational models do it. And that's also why we, as I mentioned, the kind of fiction non-fiction isn't really helpful. To be, a model is always a fiction of sorts, and particularly if you're using it to think about the future, it's fictional in one sense, and things that are described as fictional are often conveying truths, and we all sort of know that. So it's a distinction that, I mean, I've raised it now, but that's just to say it's to try to put it to bed. So a narrative model can just set out a way, what is the phrase, surrogative reasoning. It can enable you to reason about causality in a complex system where maybe the computational models don't yet reach. So moments of particular catastrophe, say, or ways of integrating thinking about social and economic factors alongside of physical and natural world realities that can't yet be modelled computationally, could be modelled in a narrative form. I mean, again, it's a UK example, but the way that the then health secretary referred to the film Contagion as helping him to understand, really, I mean, he don't think he used the words, but as it were, to model what being in a decision-making position during a pandemic might include. It included not just the epidemiology and understanding what the R number was, although the film does that really rather well. It was about vaccine strategy, and it was modelling vaccine strategy alongside of other factors. Now, that's a sort of, the narrative causal arrangements models can pick up on these instances where the quantitative can't, but absolutely not instead of. the quantitative.
Yeah, but as well as, or complement to.
Yeah. I mean, Aurora was another. It's a Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, Aurora, as a model of a quite thoughtful of a society, how arrangements of society might need to live in a zero waste world, because they're on a spaceship in this instance. But really thought through what kind of skills, what kind of hierarchies, what kind of governance, as it were, not just what happens to the atoms as you consume, grow food and consume it, but what are the social arrangements? And it doesn't mean it's predictive at all, and we'll get on to anticipation. It's not, but it's actually it's a cognitive way of cognitive model of that particular instance, which is of interest to people thinking about circular economies or other sorts of policy systems.
Yeah. I know that your interest in stories developed, I mean, you've talked about the Terminator example, but developed in a context of also thinking about strategic futures. And I know that, I'm always reminded of the introduction to The Image of the Future, which was Pollack's sort of early 70s sort of famous futures book. But there's an introduction by Kenneth Boulding, and he says that, all experiences are of the past, all decisions are about the future. So, whenever we're in the kind of INGSA context, you can't ignore that you've got to think about the future. So it's a kind of nice way to sort of wrap up, I suppose, our conversation is by turning to that. So what role does story listening play in helping think better about the future? Or is that the wrong question? I don't know. Think better about the future in order to think better about the present. I don't know.
So I mean, that's I think that the easiest way to conceptualize it is carrying on the notion of models. It's not the only form, but when making that link between evidence, which is always about the past, observational evidence, which is all about the past, and what you want to think about when you're making a decision, which is about the future. Essentially, you're kind of, you're always, as an individual or as a collective system, you're creating plausible notions of plausible futures. Hopefully, they're plausible, and then working out, how your actions might or might not enable you to move towards them. And that's where so the narrative can do several things. One is by creating narrative models of the future, provided you keep testing them with this kind of plural evidence base that we've talked about. You can't break the laws of physics, and you should be complementary to the scientific models. But provided you do that, you can then test out this kind of wider range of potential models. I mean, it's got some similarities with scenarios work, which is obviously a wide part of a significant element of a lot of futures work, is creating scenarios, including pathways to potential futures. But I think that narrative models of the future help you more to understand that you can't predict, you can't control. You can create tools to think with, and hopefully those are ones that then people can engage with, and you can bring into deliberative forms of democracy, or you can can discuss better, even if it's just a few experts in a room with a minister, or if it's a nationwide discussion about something, that you've got a better story to look at, not to tell, but to listen to or to play with. That's got a bit abstract, hasn't it? I heard, to give you an example, I heard somebody recently say government's heuristic is kind of point interventions and linear accounts. The policy making often feels like it comes down to these point interventions, linear accounts. Story listening can help. It still can help you to make sense and to be able to act, but it can do things like point up how cyclical certain types of human behaviour and indeed planetary behaviour are in terms of, say, extreme weather events or changes to the climate or pandemics, and what societies might do and how they might react to that cyclicality. Which is something that more traditional futures work which has still been based on very linear thinking, sometimes loses. So if you take Jemison's Broken Earth, is it a trilogy or is it more than that now? I don't know.
It's a trilogy, yeah.
But kind of the notion of how societies construct the space to live with repeated but quite separate in time disasters or emergencies. That's something that is really relevant now, perhaps, where we're thinking, how far does just-in-time systems, how far do the kinds of social inequalities that have led to different impacts of the epidemic, or we're trying to think about how we can adapt our advisory and our social and economic systems to the kind of repeated types of extreme risk that we're likely to face, whether it's from pandemics or extreme weather events or anything else. There are ways of modelling or anticipating potential future reactions that could be drawn out of listening carefully to stories. Actually, particularly, there's some really interesting work from Indigenous people's literatures, which tends to play with the notions of time a bit, some of which plays with the notions of time, which is also could be relevant. I mean, you can see why, I mean, Sue and I know, but why in the book we've tried to tread really carefully, because it's so easy, and I think people are often, to start talking about time, fluidity of time, when you're in the room with a physicist, it's going to be hard, I mean, it really is, because it's quite, it can feel risky on all sides. I mean, this is like interdisciplinary work generally. You start coming out of your disciplinary boundaries and you're using words that mean different things to the people that you're talking to, and they understand them differently. And it's quite threatening to people, to risking your academic credibility or whatever it might be. But it's really important, because by staying in an academic bubble, in a disciplinary bubble, you're not letting your knowledge get into the public sphere as fast as it could otherwise do.
Yeah. And there's a kind of more positive spin on it, which is not that it's dangerous or threatening, but that it's beautiful and rewarding and mind expanding, and both gets your knowledge into different places, but changes what you know and how you know, and then comes back and changes that discipline, and not in ways that threaten or challenge the kind of core values, methods, principles of that discipline. But working with you over the past 3 years has totally changed the way I think about what I do and why I do it in a faculty of English, and that's been incredibly rewarding. But you have to be prepared to take that risk.
Can I mention, so one area that we looked at that we haven't mentioned so far was economics, and this is also relevant to anticipation, classical economic, or a lot of economic modelling particularly struggles with the collapse of systems, and so there's been the beginnings of really interesting work around narratives and anticipation, particularly of disruption. So work on literature in advance of the economic crisis of the first decade of the 21st century, suggesting the ways in which story listening to the work of, I don't know, Don DeLillo or Martin Amis or whomever. No, anyhow, you know what I mean. Could help to again anticipate, possibly to reframe, provide new points of view about elements of the economic systems that were unknowable, unquantifiable, but clearly had, with hindsight at least, have the potential to disrupt the ways of functioning of the economic system in ways that would then impact the world. And story listening. So in the other strand of this is Robert Shiller, the Nobel laureate's recent book on narrative economics, where he's talking about stories as data, because stories clearly do affect markets, because they affect behaviors, and behaviors then affect markets. So there's a kind of interesting strand of thinking developing amongst some of the economists about how stories inform and therefore enable anticipation of future economic behaviours that could be really important in terms of policy making. And indeed, brings back to the pandemic. If you've then got a better understanding of behaviours in economics, you might move away from the problem that Pilke was pointing out of as essentially epidemiologists over here, economists in that room, and all other forms of knowledge not in the party, sort of thing.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Schiller is that he doesn't talk about what we'd call, textual stories, or what people might more traditionally think about as fiction. And I think one of the really important things that, you know, we've learned, and I've learned listening to you again now, is that you can't separate off kind of literary stories or fictional stories or films from the other ways in which stories operate throughout society and other disciplines, and that thinking about story as something that moves across, and not saying, well, it's science fiction or it's made up, therefore we don't have to think about it, but we do have to think about the stories people tell each other. That division's not going to be helpful.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think what would help is kind of better ways of articulating, though, what expertise means in this area. I mean, you have to be really careful, because kind of we're not talking, and you've never talked in a kind of Me Too way, you know, sort of as in, you know, I want to be part of the party because of the policy party, because you know, therefore humanities will get more funding, to be, you know, caricature. Yeah, just want to put it on the table. It's really not. What I do think sometimes, you know, from the scientist's point of view, if I can put it, is how do humanities people, or how do literary scholars in this instance, how do you convey rigor in a simple way, equivalent to the way in which the scientific method is, I mean, oversimplistically considered to be. In other words, you know, kind of people have a notion that scientific evidence is of high quality and rigor because it's disprovable, because, you know, it's subject to experimentation, it's based on observation, and it can always be proved wrong. And there's a kind of rigor of the system, yeah. So you don't have to trust the scientist. You're actually never trusting the individual, or you shouldn't be. You're trusting the system that has enabled this individual or this group of individuals to create the knowledge that they have, yeah. And what I've learned from you is that actually the same is true of the humanities. You know, I love working with you, but I don't have to, you know, trust you and your worldview, and kind of therefore everything you say is you know, therefore true. I know that you're informed by, and you're held to account by, an incredibly rigorous set of ways of thinking and creating knowledge. But somehow that doesn't always seem to come across. And, you know, as it were, one person's view on a story is considered to be, going back to my Terminator kind of chaos, you know, amateur moment, is considered to be as good as another's. And so I think one of the concepts that we've talked about is kind of narrative literacy. You know, everybody, ideally in a perfect world, everybody, all of us, would be narratively literate, in the sense that we know that stories matter. We know that sometimes they really matter, and actually under certain circumstances it's worth bringing in some experts to help us to understand how and why that mattering matters. Just as, you know, you spend money, you probably run a bank account, but you do know that sometimes you need an economist. Yeah, you absorb stories, you use stories as a human being, but you actually sometimes you might want this extra set of, you know, you might want the climate scientist, or you might want the economist, and there's an equivalent on the humanities that I think it's a bit harder to convey sometimes. What's the rigor? I mean, how would you convey rigor?
I've just got the note from Grant that we're running out of time, and that's not to dodge in any way that question, but actually I know that it's a question you've asked me many times over the last few years, and the more I think about it, actually, the more I think that the answers I'd give would map onto science. It's about having, you know, robust methods of investigation that are recognized within your discipline or your subfield. So we talk about the scientific method, but, you know, a physicist doesn't do the same as a biologist, who doesn't do the same as a, you know, an XYZ. So, you know, what are the most effective, rigorous methods of investigation of your object of study, depending on what that object of study is, and then there has to be a fit. And then there is gathering sufficient evidence in order to make well-grounded arguments and claims. There is peer review, you know, we have that too. There's the sense in which disciplines evolve because of disagreement, because people make, you know, claims or arguments or present knowledge that is then interrogated, disputed, refuted, and that's how it moves on and develops. We do have a habit still to, you know, go back to Plato and Socrates as if nothing's changed since then. So there's maybe a longer disciplinary memory in the humanities possibly than in the sciences, but all of those methods that guarantee the rigor of our knowledge are not, I don't think, radically or wildly dissimilar to scientific methods. The difference is in those that specific, the tools that you use in order to analyze your object of study. And the tools for literary studies would be things like narratology, you know, words that kind of don't, just like the specific scientific instrument that a scientist would use might be unknown to me. Things like narratology, things like discourse, order, voice, all of these things that are technical terms, we maybe need to be bolder about saying we have technical toolkits as well that enable us to analyze these kinds of texts in rigorous ways. So maybe that's a short answer without dodging the bullet. I have a very familiar feeling at the moment, which is that real disappointment in having to stop talking to you, which I've always felt whenever we've had to cut our meetings off over the past few years. At least we can carry on talking to each other, and if people who've listened to the conversation are interested, we can give a quick plug for the book. So it's Storylistening, Narrative Evidence and Public Reasoning. It's being published by Routledge in November. I think there's possibly a 30%, 20% off pre-order offer at the moment if you want to go to Routledge's website, and I'm sure that Claire and I will be hopefully talking about it more in public over the next 6 months or so. But right now it's just time for me to say thank you, Claire. It is as always an absolute pleasure to talk with you, and to say thank you to anyone who's tuned in to listen. Many thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.